I think with this show, some of the challenges that I went into and dealing with and trying to develop were larger pieces, and with those larger pieces, I found it first off, physically, I had to paint them differently than I did my smaller pieces. My smaller pieces, I could literally work over a tabletop and hover above them, whereas with the larger pieces now, they had to be painted on a vertical surface, and it forced me to stand back, to actually almost disappear more into the painting. Then there was more of a, I guess, I would say an atmospheric quality being in the painting while it's being painted versus the crafting of an object with the smaller ones. And with the larger pieces, I think I went to a heavier canvas, and just to get the strength in spanning that space between the stretcher bars, and there was more texture to deal with, and the result was dealing with the texture, started to investigate a more scumbled edged shape, a softening of the shapes in the back, and that kind of, I found it was something I could use to talk about atmosphere, about an experience that was more in those expanses of the image that were more undefined, that were more maybe atmospheric and ambiguous. And I wanted to kind of have a dialogue between those shapes, the hard-edged ones, the soft edge, and result being that you get an atmospheric quality. And I found it interesting because it's something that has drawn my interest, is sometimes what we see and how we think what we see is what we see. And quite often we see with our minds, and I don't think we're conscious of that. It's our brains doing the seeing and not so much the external eyeballs as maybe as a little person, as a child, would like to believe. And so with that kind of dialogue about the shapes, it brought back a lot of the feelings I've always enjoyed about positive and negative space, about flat color. And with some of the pieces too, I started to investigate natural, more the greenery, the trees, the forests that some of the structures were happening in. In previous work, it was mostly architectural, mechanical, and I still have a large desire to work with those subject matter. I found the challenge to force myself to engage with the landscape, the hills, the trees that are all through British Columbia, and that was new to me. It was almost, in some case, as with the one-piece interior bridge, diving into the trees and just sorting it out, figuring it out as I went through the painting. I started at the top and worked to the bottom. The trees at points had me feeling like, overwhelmed, out of my depth. But I'm happy with the result. But it's the process that I find so enjoyable to when painting for oneself and exploring the highs and the lows of the creation of the artwork. But with that piece particular too, I wanted to create a symmetrical image that wasn't necessarily truly symmetrical, but yet has symmetry in its construction. And I think that was important to me, that I, on some level, violate the symmetry as well as embrace it in the two arches. The surrounding area is just a collection of shapes and interplay, and they swim around the harder structures. With these pieces, I'm also talking about locale is the name of the show, and that is, again, I think it's an extension of where I was in my last show, but I think they're newer spaces handled, and they're places that I think they have a message to them, and they're usually they're spaces we pass through usually without even thinking about it, whether we're in our car or on foot. And again, I wanted to take the banality of those subjects, which I did in previous ones, but also I think with these pieces there's a softness to some of them that the light is softer and the colors are less severe. And I think that may be a byproduct of the difference of light quality from some of the prairie pieces I've done to pieces that are executed here on the West Coast, where the light is more, I think it's a higher humidity in the air, and it gives a softness to the images. There's a diffusion of light, and whereas the dry humidity of the prairies gives a much darker, harsher edged shadow, and the shapes there are almost sometimes more readily apparent, whereas when I was doing some of these pieces I had to really work through the subject matter to find those shapes and the interplay and the dialogue between the shapes, the positive and the negative. And that's kind of what this show is about. I guess this is interesting as I'm talking to this, is that there is a softness and a growth in that, a subtlety, a gentleness in some of this work that maybe some of my previous work didn't have.